Hello, my name is Vyoma Jha and I'll be your instructor for the next 30 minutes covering the module on climate change. Climate change today is shaped by challenges that are increasingly unpredictable and context-driven. The effects of climate change are increasingly non-linear and difficult to forecast. As a lawyer, one needs to be well-versed in the history of the climate change problem, understand the science behind it, and accordingly prepare for the legal and policy responses to address the issue of climate change. The law of climate change thus involves a wide gamut of issues and its better understanding. In today's module, we try and introduce students to the developing field of climate change law. We begin with providing a sufficient background to the history of the climate change problem. We then explore the science behind the issue of climate change and then proceed to highlight the major international legal instruments to address the issue of climate change. In 2007-08, the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Report referred to climate change as the defining human development challenge of the 21st century. It called climate change not just a future scenario, rather something that has overwhelming scientific evidence pointing towards irreversible ecological catastrophe. The impacts of climate change were said to be global in scope and unprecedented in scale. Taking a look at when the problem of climate change emerged for the first time, the World Meteorological Organization, or the WMO, in association with the United Nations Environment Programme, or the UNEP, convened the first World Climate Conference in February 1979 in Geneva. This was a landmark event as it was the first major international meeting on climate change attended by scientists from a wide range of disciplines. The purpose of this meeting was to assess the state of knowledge of climate and to consider the effects of climate variability and climate change on human society. Following the first World Conference on Climate, the World Climate Programme and the World Climate Research Programs were established. The aim of these two scientific programs was to develop fundamental scientific understanding of the physical climate system and the extent of human influence on climate. Following the creation of the World Climate Programme and the World Climate Research Programme, in 1998, the WMO and the UNEP created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. The IPCC was a scientific intergovernmental body which aimed to assess scientific information relevant to human-induced climate change, the impacts of such human-induced climate change, and the options for adaptation or mitigation. In 1990, the IPCC published its first assessment report, where it found that climate change was the result of anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide, that is, emissions resulting from human activities. There was a substantial increase in the atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, which in turn enhanced the greenhouse effect, resulting on average in an additional warming of the Earth's surface. The first assessment report of the IPCC further found that carbon dioxide was responsible for over half the enhanced greenhouse gas effect in the past and was likely to remain so in the future. And stabilization of atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases at today's levels, that is 1990 levels, would require immediate reduction of emissions from human activities by over 60%. The first assessment report of the IPCC later served to be the basis of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, something which we will cover in a few more moments. The IPCC, in turn, has now become a well-established player in reviewing worldwide climate science research, issuing regular assessment reports, and compiling special reports and technical papers on the science behind climate change. The findings of these IPCC assessment reports reflect global scientific consensus and frequently play a major role in international climate negotiations. Since 1990, the IPCC has released 5 assessment reports that have reached the conclusion that climate change is a real problem and that climate change is a man-made problem. The 4th assessment report of the IPCC was released in 2007 and propelled climate change into popular consciousness with its observations and future projections on climate change impacts. Some of the key findings of the 4th assessment report are as follows. Warming of the climate system is unequivocal, as is now evident from observations of increases in global average air and ocean temperatures, widespread melting of snow and ice, and a rising global average sea level. Second, most of the global average warming over the past 50 years has very likely been caused due to human activities. Impacts of climate change will very likely increase due to increased frequencies and intensities of extreme weather events. Anthropogenic warming and sea level rise would also continue for centuries if greenhouse gas emissions were to be reduced sufficiently for concentrations to stabilize today, simply due to the timescales associated with climate processes and feedbacks. Some planned adaptation of human activities is occurring now, but more extensive adaptation is required to reduce the vulnerability to climate change. Unmitigated climate change would, in the long term, be likely to exceed the capacity of natural, managed, and human systems to adapt. The most conclusive finding of the 4th assessment report was that many impacts of climate change can be reduced, delayed, or avoided by mitigation. Later, the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize was shared in equal parts between the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and Al Gore for both their efforts to build up and disseminate greater knowledge about man-made climate change and to lay the foundations for the measures that are needed to counteract such change. In 2013, IPCC released its 5th assessment report that has provided more clarity about human-induced climate change than ever before. Some of the key findings of the 5th assessment report are that agricultural yields are expected to drop in most regions of the world if the temperature increase is more than a few degrees. Diseases, especially those carried by vectors like mosquitoes, could spread to newer areas in the world. Millions of people are expected to be exposed to increasing water stress, as well as unprecedented flooding. More intense weather-related disasters combined with rising sea levels and other climate-related stresses will make the lives of those living on coastlines particularly vulnerable, and extinctions are expected from the current warming trends. These findings are in addition to the conclusive scientific evidence which was presented in the previous assessment reports of the IPCC, proving or implying that climate change is a man-made problem. Having taken a look at the scientific evidence behind the issue of climate change, we now try and proceed to understand what the international legal response to this has been. As I mentioned earlier, the first assessment report of the IPCC ended up proving to be the basis for the creation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or popularly known as the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC today is the principal legal instrument adopted by states to address the issue of climate change. The treaty was negotiated at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, also known as the Earth Summit, held at Rio in 1992. The ultimate objective of the treaty is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Currently, there are 196 countries which are parties to the convention. The Conference of Parties, or the COP, is the supreme body of the UNFCCC, which aims to assess the progress in dealing with the issue of climate change. All parties to the UNFCCC are represented at the COP, which meets every year unless the parties decide otherwise. The COP reviews the implementation of the convention and any other legal instruments that have been adopted by the COP, and is responsible for all decision making to ensure the effective implementation of the ultimate objectives of the UNFCCC.